Hey everybody, it's Mr. Wagstaff. Cool stuff to talk about today. Alright, so we were talking about the 1800s. This is what this unit is more of the culture that's going to grow inside the United States in the 1800s. Yesterday we were talking about the era of good feelings. Today we're going to talk about more specific culture stuff. So let's just go ahead and hop into it and talk about some cool stuff today. So you can't start talking about America if you don't talk about religion, all right? So America, founded with, Pilgrims and Puritans, are founded by Protestant Christian groups. So America has always been a very strongly Protestant Christian country, the majority. It's not an official religion. We adamantly do not have an official religion. We are against having an official religion because that's literally the motivation for pushing us over to America. Is to get away from having this mandated religion and certain type of religious practices that we don't want to deal with. So in the New World, even though it's America now, we're well past New World time period, we're in America. We, meaning America, is still a devoutly Protestant Christian population. The vast majority is. So every now and then, even though we are devout Christians in our history as Americans, we go through periods where we're like, oh my gosh, we don't have enough Jesus in our lives. And we think that all of a sudden we are not Christian enough. So we have these time periods in American history, these like massive revivals where we get super religious again. One of those is going to happen in the 1800s. And if it was just, and it's called the Second Great Awakening, the First Great Awakening, it happened back in Europe. And this is just a revival of these traveling preachers would travel around the country. They'd give these huge revivals outside and everybody gets super, religious. If this was just a story of all of a sudden America got more religious, it probably wouldn't make it into U.S. history. All right, not in a survey course. It would absolutely make it into history, but in a high school survey course, probably wouldn't make the cut. However, there is a very, very important outcome that comes out of America becoming very religious in the early 1800s. Specifically, the Second Great Awakening, where everybody got really, really religious. And it has to do with slaves. All right, so people go to church. All right, and they go to church a lot. All of a sudden, Second Great Awakening, and people go to church even more. So, in the Christian religion, and while a lot of the people I'm teaching to here probably grew up in a Protestant church, there's a lot that have not. So I'll simplify it for you so that you're not lost if you're not familiar with the teachings in the Protestant Christian church, which is Methodist, Presbyterian, Baptist, Seventh-day Adventist, any of that is Protestant. So, how churches make money, all right, let's start off with that. How churches make money is people giving tithes or offerings or giving money to the church. That is how churches make money. So churches need people to pay tithes and offerings, optional most of the time, to keep them afloat. So the thing is that especially in the South, who's the only real people that have money at the time? And we haven't really gone into the economics of it, so I'll give you kind of a precursor here because you may not know that off the top of your heads. Most of the people in the South are extremely poor. Extremely poor. Like, poorest people in the country live in the South. All right? There is a small group of crazy wealthy people in the South by Southern standards, and they're the slave owners. So the majority of people in the South, majority of the white people in the South, do not own slaves. A slave, and as we'll get there later on, purchasing a slave, I got to change my numbers now because as we move further, in modern society, owning a slave is probably the equivalent financially of about $80,000. To own a slave, it costs $80,000 in modern money, all right? So the vast majority of people can never afford that. They're not going to own a slave. However, the people that do own slaves own these massive plantations and they make tons of money. So the people who do own slaves might own 100 of them. So the vast majority of white people in the South were dirt poor, working and were farmers themselves. So the slaves, which were almost exclusively African American at the time, were just black Africans. I guess I only say that difference is because once they become citizens, then they become African. It's you're splitting hairs. All right. Slaves are black, and the owners, 99.999% of the time, would be white. There were exceptions. You can always find exceptions. But so people tend to simplify it and think that all slaves are every black person was a slave and every white person owned slaves. Definitely not the case, but if you were a slave, you were probably black, and if you were a slave owner, you were probably white. Even though it's like the top 1%, maybe a little bit more than that, maybe 5% in the South had the ability to own slaves, right? And if you didn't own slaves, you probably never saw a slave, just because you're in your own little world and slaves didn't leave their plantations. So a plantation is basically like a city. So if you're a slave on a plantation, and we'll talk about more of the horrors of being owned and not having ownership and your life doesn't matter, you may never leave your plantation. But it's like a small city. So the reason how all this works back to the Second Great Awakening is that churches need the plantation owners to come to church because they're the ones with the money. They're the ones who can give tithes and offerings. All right. So when the slave owners go to church, they are taught, and this ends up being a split here in the mid 1800s between the churches in the North and the South. The churches in the South pretty much teach that slavery is a necessary evil, or that it's just necessary, or that it's okay. As crazy as that sounds, they point to all these time periods in the Bible in which slavery exists. So you don't want to tick off all your plantation owners, otherwise they won't fund your church. However, one of the things that happens in the Second Great Awakening that the churches are going to change is in the Christian Protestant religion, if as a Christian, in order to go to heaven, one of the things that you have to do is you have to tell everybody you know about the Word of God. That is, like, tell everybody about the Bible, tell everybody about Christianity. If you choose not to do that, that's like one of the big no-nos in the Christian religion, and then you're not going to make it into heaven. So that's one of the belief systems in Protestant Christianity is you have to spread the word. So a lot of these plantation owners who go to church, and they know at church they're going to tell them it's okay to be a slave owner and all that, they start hearing that, hey, you're responsible for telling every human being that you're in contact with about Jesus. This is new, because back home they got about 100 slaves have never heard nothing about a Jesus. In the Second Great Awakening, the teachings start to become, if you don't teach the slaves about Jesus, you, as a plantation owner, aren't going to go to heaven. This terrifies the plantation owners. And they're like, I got to go to heaven. So what do? Is they now are going to allow the slaves to come to church. That's a huge change here in the 1800s. Huge change. So, if you're a slave, it's got to be baffling. You wake up one morning like, all right, we're going to church. And the slaves are like, what? What is church? And just imagine, like, there's 100 of you as a slave, and they pile you on the wagons, and they take you out. Now, keep in mind, there's no fences or anything for slavery. You just grow up on a plantation, and there's, like, maybe 500 acres or whatever. It's like a small city, basically. And you just see a tree line off in the distance. You've never left the plantation. You may not know what's on the other side of those trees. You probably don't. That's why they don't have to make any fences. How are you going to survive? Keep in mind, sometimes the slaves don't know where food comes from. If you're growing cotton or you're growing tobacco, may not have any idea where food comes from. You eat corn for dinner because the owner provides you a corn. You may have no idea where that came from or how to grow it. The slaves are aggressively kept ignorant. It was like illegal to teach them to read and write. Couldn't do any of that. And that is why they didn't escape. And we'll talk about the Underground Railroad when we get there, but it's that is itty bitty, very few people dealt with that or escaped through the Underground Railroad. So slaves really don't know how life works. And that ignorance is what keeps them from escaping, because they don't run out past the woods because they don't know what's over there. But now all of a sudden one Sunday morning, you're going to get on a wagon and they're going to take you down the road that you've never been down. And you're like, oh my gosh, what's happening? And so your entire life, family, like everybody you know is on these wagons, and then you go down the street and you get to a church. Now the slaves had to go sit in the balcony, all right, segregated. But here's what blows their minds. They've never known what's outside their plantation. When they get to church, you know what else shows up? Other wagons filled with slaves from other plantations. That's important information. All of a sudden, you're like, wait a minute. There's more people like this? Huh. They may not have ever even thought about the idea that they were a slave. They were just told from the time they were born, this is what you do. Never thought about it. Just a thing. So there wasn't a lot of rebellion against being a slave by people who were born slaves, because they had no idea they were supposed to be rebelling against it. Like that is why it was illegal to educate slaves, is because once they realized what type of raw deal they got, they fought against it. If you never educate them, they'll never fight against it. But you show up at church, and the slaves are like, okay, so they go to the balcony, and this is the most exciting time of the week, probably, because they get to get out, and leave. And not surprisingly, the slaves become devout Christians very quickly. Now, so many slaves showed up, and they vastly outnumbered the white congregation, that it didn't take long before the white congregation was like, all right, yeah, we're not going to let this keep happening. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to build a separate church right next door, and this is where the slaves will go have church, while we have church here in the white church. So every Sunday, the slaves would show up to church, and they would go to church. Well, here's what's really interesting, all right? And I don't know if the plantation owners didn't think this through or not. There's a lot of stories in the Bible, all right? So they become devout Christians, the slaves do, all right? And they want to do what God wants them to do. They're devout Christians. Well, they start hearing stories in the Bible, specifically the story of Moses in the book of Exodus. Now, I'm not going to pop quiz you on your Sunday school if you grew up in a Protestant Christian church. So here's the story of Moses. Moses, this is way back. This is thousands of years before Jesus. The story of Moses is God speaks to Moses through a burning bush. He's like, hey, Moses, this is not how God sounds, so I don't want to be disrespectful, but this is my caricature of, yeah, I just feel like I'm going to get in trouble now. So with myself, I'm sorry. Anywho, so God's like, hey, Moses, go on down here to Egypt. So you're Jewish, Moses, and my people who are Jewish people that follow God before Jesus, they're all down here in Egypt under control of the Pharaoh, and they're forced to be in slaves, and I don't like it. I need you to go get them back. So Moses goes down to Egypt, goes down and sees the Pharaoh and says, let my people go. And Pharaoh's like, no. And then there's like locusts, and there's plagues, and there's all these horrible things happen. And finally Pharaoh's like, all right, you can go. And you can take all the slaves. So Moses is like, cool. So he takes all the slaves, all right, like thousands and hundreds of thousands of them, and leaves Egypt. And then the Pharaoh's like, oh my gosh, I don't have any workers anymore. And then he's going to chase after them to go get them back, because he's like changed his mind now. Takes them out to what's called the Red Sea. When they get to the Red Sea, Moses is like, oh no, how am I going to cross this? And this is the story in the Bible where, I say put his staff down, the Red Sea parts with the help of God, and they cross through the Red Sea, and as the Pharaoh comes behind them, the Red Sea collapses and completely wipes out Pharaoh. Now, one of the many, many, many famous stories of the Bible, and it's only about halfway through that specific story. That story continues to go with they get lost for 40 years trying to find their way back to Israel, and then God gives the 10 Commandments to Moses, and anywho, that story in itself really had a strong impact on the slaves. Because not only do they now know that they are slaves, for the first time ever, according to that story, guess what God doesn't like? That's right, slavery. Once they learn the story of Moses and how Moses was sent to go free God's children, God's chosen people from being slaves because God doesn't want his people to be slaves, well, that's the beginning of the end of slavery. And here's why. Prior to this, there were no rebellions, really, all right? There's no organized fight by the slaves against being slaves because they didn't know any better. Now, not only do they know that it is against what God wants, right? Not only do they know that God doesn't want them to be slaves, but that they are slaves. And once the slaves in America realize they're slaves, realize God doesn't want to be slaves, guess what they don't want to be anymore? Slaves. It seems crazy that you wouldn't naturally just not want to be a slave, but once the Second Great Awakening educates them enough to realize what they are and that they don't want to be that anymore, is the beginning of the end of slavery, because slaves are going to agree, like, if you don't want to do something, you can get pretty stubborn about it. And the slaves start slowly, and it's not an instantaneous thing, but we'll start rebelling against the plantation owners slowly over time. And the Second Great Awakening is the beginning of the end of slavery. So that's what these two questions are. So pause me if you haven't already gotten these and answer those completely, and we'll move on. All right, trails to the west. Manifest destiny. So we as Americans tend to look at religion and manipulate it for our own gains. All right, this here is a good example of that. All right, so a little picture of people over there. All right, I'll put myself over it. So America is going to start spreading west. All right, we have secured the colonies, the 13 states, everything's set up, and we just keep adding states, and we keep spreading west. There's nothing here. There's tons of Native Americans and all that, but not only do we want to spread west, we have this idea that we call manifest destiny, and it is the most it's racist in the term of the belief that your race is superior to everybody else's. And we're talking about the American race. That the belief that the American people are like God's chosen people, and we as Americans are responsible to spread west, even if we don't want to. And we call it manifest destiny. It is our responsibility to spread our awesomeness onto everybody else that we can. So manifest destiny is a term used in the 1840s to justify our expansion west. It's not just to justify it. It is like our battle cry as Americans. Like, even if we woke up one day like, oh, I don't want to take over more stuff. Well, God just made us so awesome. Got to anyway. So manifest destiny is us aggressively spreading west. It is the belief that we are chosen people. And there's really it's not just that it's okay to do, but we're supposed to do it. So even though we're taking lands from people, just aggressively spreading west for generations, it's not that it's, is it right or wrong? It's we felt we were required to do it. Here's a little picture of a painting of what manifest destiny would look like. That, we got all this civilization, great family structures, kids playing, you got trains, all this other stuff here, wagons, all this stuff. And then out here, just wild wilderness, just ready to be tamed. Now, do people live out there? Absolutely, Native Americans. And it's only been in the last 100 years, since 1900, that we have really looked back, and when I say 1900, probably in the 1970s, that we've looked back on this and been like, oh man, like how messed up our entire logic is of how we just literally just wiped out an entire race of people in the middle of the country. Like we knew it was bad since then, but now it's time to look back on it and we're like, oh, this is awful. So at the time, like completely lost on people that you're going to completely eradicate entire people's way of life because they were looked at as inferior because racism, the belief that Americans are superior to anybody else. And so this is a painting of manifest destiny. All right. Changing gears here. Florida. All right. So Florida, I'll change this picture real quick. This here is Florida. So, I'll move myself over here a little bit. Boop, 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 boop. So America starts moving down in this region right here. This is Georgia, all right, in the southern part of Georgia, in order to colonize it. All right. The problem is there's some Indians down there that don't like having all their lands taken from them. Now, there's this border here, all right, between Florida and Georgia, Florida-Georgia line. This border here, all right, because Spain owns Florida. One of the reasons Spain still owns Florida, even if they haven't really set up any type of permanent civilization here, is because they believe there's a fountain of youth. That's right. They believe there is a fountain of youth in Florida. So the Spanish have owned Florida because they think there's a fountain of youth here, and they're not willing to give it up. So they have like 3 governmental employees there and a whole bunch of like nothing they've never organized. So America moves down here into Georgia. But there's some Indians down in this region, and they're called the Seminole Indians. And this is going to lead to the Seminole Wars. All right. So what happens is the Indians have understood boundaries and property lines and all that. Now, they don't really abide by them, but they understand them. So they know down here, this is one country owns this, and the people up here are owned by another country, and the people from here can't go here, and the people from here aren't allowed to go here, and they're like, interesting. All right. So what they're going to do is all these settlers that are around in this region, the Seminole Indians don't want them there. So in the middle of the night, they will run across the border and attack these settlers here and try to drive them away. I mean, awful brutality on both sides. And they turn around and they'll just attack them, and the American government gets furious because they'll attack the settlers and then run right back into Spain's territory. And America's like, Spain, what are you doing? Stop them. And Spain's like, oh, okay. And they don't. And like the next night, the Seminoles run back into Georgia, kill more people, and then run back into Florida. And America's like, dude, what are you doing? Stop your Indians. And they're like, okay. And they don't. Finally, what ends up happening is America, all right, we get tired of having our colonists or our settlers killed here. So we just send our military into Florida, and we kill all the Indians that are there. And that's what the Seminole Wars are, is the American military coming into Florida, which is actually owned by Spain, and killing Indians. Now, who's going to be upset about that? Spain. Like, crazy furious, all right? So Spain's like, what are you doing? You can't do that. And America's mad that Spain hasn't done anything about it. And Spain's mad that we've, like, invaded their territory. So we are, like, pretty buffaloed up at each other. Well, there's 2 guys that are going to work out a compromise here, and it's called the Adams-Onis Treaty, all right? And it's basically going to work out, like, how are we going to deal with this situation, all right? And the Adams-Onis Treaty is pretty important. Let me move myself over here, all right? So the Adams-Onis Treaty is important because Spain agrees to just give us Florida. They're like, fine, you can have Florida. We don't really want it. No fountain of youth if that's what you're looking for. We're like, yeah, we're not morons. We know there's no fountain of youth. But so the Adams-Onis Treaty, America is going to get Florida. All right, so that's how we acquire Florida. There's also this big hunk of land up here, Oregon country. Now, we'd already talked about yesterday the Oregon Trail. We've already been like going through their territory, but nobody really has any claim on it, and it's obvious that we're probably going to use it. So Oregon country here was Spain's in theory. Spain is also going to give that to us. So Spain is going to give us the Florida and Oregon area. All right, it's not an actual state or anything. It's just a random area. And what we are going to do is we are going to acknowledge, all right, this line right here. This line right here divides the difference in what is present day Mexico and the United States. So yeah, Mexico, and again, doesn't permanently stay like this, but this area down here is referred to as Mexico. It's Mexican territory that is owned by Spain, and it was called New Spain at the time, more than Mexico. But this red line right here is what divides that. So we all agree on that, and everybody's on the up and up of what happens. So notice this whole area right here is called Texas, and you got California and New Mexico and Arizona. All of that will be individual stories, right? So at this point in the story, this right here, anything below this line is owned by Spain, and we have all this stuff here. So we got, honestly, the only reason we got Florida is because we wanted to kill Indians. Like, it's pretty messed up. This is, I showed you a picture yesterday as well, but this is a map of the Oregon Trail. Boop, 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 boop. All right, so explain what the boundaries now are with Spain and the United States after the Adams-Onis Treaty. So kind of explain at this point in the story who owns what where, and then why did Spain agree to give us Florida with the Adams-Onis Treaty, and what was the issue involving Florida? All right, that is as far as we're going to get today. We will pick up tomorrow with something really, really cool, pretty intricate compromise called the Missouri Compromise. So finish part 3, and I will see you guys tomorrow.